In the days when the land of Israel was marked by tension and dread, when King Saul sat upon the throne but lacked the strength to stand, when the armies of the living God trembled not from arrows but from a single voice echoing through the valley of Elah, a giant named Goliath emerged daily from the Philistine ranks, his body a mountain of flesh and iron, his voice deep and defiant, his shadow stretching across the battlefield like a storm rolling in from the west. And he stood not just as a man of war, but as a symbol of fear, arrogance, and human pride, challenging Israel to send a man to fight him one-on-one, declaring a contest that would determine the fate of two nations without shedding the blood of thousands, and day after day for 40 days. He mocked Israel, cursed their God, and demanded a challenger, yet none arose, not Saul the king, tall though he was, anointed though he had been, nor any general or warrior who had tasted battle before. For Goliath's stature broke their courage, and his threats crushed their faith, and all of Israel stood paralyzed, forgetting the God who had split seas, who had rained bread from heaven, who had shaken the walls of Jericho with praise, who had made covenants with their fathers. Meanwhile, far from the battlefield, in the hills of Bethlehem, a young shepherd boy named David, the youngest of 8 sons, watched over sheep and worshipped under the stars, composing psalms for an audience of heaven. And though the world overlooked him, heaven had not. For the prophet Samuel had already poured oil upon his head in secret, declaring him the future king of Israel while Saul still reigned. And though David went back to the pasture after that anointing, though he returned to solitude and stillness, God was preparing him in the hidden places, teaching him to slay beasts when no one saw, giving him the courage to chase lions, the reflexes to strike bears, and the heart to trust not in weapons, but in the name of the Lord. And it was on an ordinary day that Jesse, his father, sent him to the battlefield with bread and cheese, with an assignment so simple it seemed meaningless. Yet destiny often rides in on the back of errands. And as David arrived and heard Goliath's voice bellow once again across the valley, saw the men retreating, saw the fear on the faces of his own brothers, something stirred inside him that would not be silenced, a fire that refused to bow to fear. And he asked the question that no one else had the courage to ask. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And immediately resistance rose, not from the enemy, but from his own people, his own family, his oldest brother Eliab, rebuking him sharply, accusing him of pride, belittling his assignment, saying, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep?" But David knew that being underestimated by man meant nothing when you had been anointed by God, and so he responded not with anger, but with clarity. "Is there not a cause?" And kept asking, kept pressing, until word reached King Saul, who summoned the boy. And before a king paralyzed by fear stood a youth unafraid, declaring boldly, "Let no one lose heart because of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." And when Saul questioned his ability, David testified not of training, not of swords, but of how the God who had delivered him from the paw of the lion and the claw of the bear would deliver him again from the hand of this giant. And Saul, desperate for hope, agreed, offering his own armor. But David tried it on and quickly took it off, saying, "I cannot go in these, for I am not used to them." Because you cannot fight God's battles in man's armor, and you cannot walk into your calling wearing someone else's identity. So David walked out just as he was, with his sling and staff, with 5 smooth stones from the brook tucked into his shepherd's pouch, with no armor, no title, no position, only a covenant and a calling. And as he descended into the valley, Goliath saw him and laughed, cursed him by his gods, and said, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" But David did not flinch, and he did not negotiate. For when you are secure in who your God is, the enemy's words have no power. And he lifted his voice and said, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel, and all those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." And with that, David ran the danger but straight into it. For courage doesn't tiptoe, it charges. And with a single stone released from his sling, propelled not by muscle but by divine precision, the giant fell, struck in the forehead, collapsing face first into the dust, and the sound of his fall shook the valley like thunder. And David, without hesitation, ran to him, drew the giant's own sword, and cut off his head, holding it high before both armies. And the Philistines fled in terror, while the Israelites surged forward, courage restored, chasing their enemies all the way to the gates of Ekron. And the spoils of the enemy were claimed by a people who hadn't even fought, but had been inspired by one who believed. And after the dust settled and the shouting died down, David brought Goliath's head to Jerusalem, and his sword he kept in his tent, a reminder not of what he had done, but what God had done through him. And when Saul asked, "Whose son is this youth?" for he saw the boy but could not comprehend the calling, David answered, "I am the son of your servant, Jesse the Bethlehemite." And though that answer was simple, it carried the weight of destiny, for David the shepherd had become a deliverer, a prototype of a greater deliverer to come. And as his name echoed through Israel, songs were sung of him. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And though envy would later chase him into caves and Saul would attempt to take his life, David's heart would remain fixed on God, and his victory in the valley would become a symbol for all time, not just of overcoming odds, but of what happens when faith faces fear and does not flinch. And even now, generations later, Goliath still stands, not in armor, but in the form of shame, regret, addiction, anxiety, the wounds of the past, the noise of failure. And he still taunts, still bellows, still dares you to step forward, and fear still tells you to stay quiet, to blend in, to sit down. But David's story whispers through time, saying, "Is there not a cause?" And reminding us that courage is not about size, but about sight. Seeing God rightly, seeing the battle as his, knowing that when you step forward in faith, heaven backs you up. And the truth is, we all have slings, we all have stones, gifts, callings, truths, words, tears, prayers, time, obedience. And though they may seem small in our hands, they are mighty in the hands of God. And giants still fall when shepherds still step up, when the anointed say yes, when the overlooked remember that the same God who was with them in the field will be with them in the fight. And when the world sees weakness, but heaven sees a warrior and no one else is willing, that's often when God says, "I choose you." So when the enemy rises, when fear roars loud, when the shadow in front of you seems too big to move, remember the valley, remember the voice of defiance, remember the boy who believed and the God who never failed him, and the stone that struck true, and know that your battle is not yours but the Lord's, and he is still the God who trains your hands for war and your fingers for battle. Still the God who lifts up the humble and casts down the proud. Still the God who chooses the youngest, the smallest, the least likely, to remind the world that his strength is made perfect in weakness, and that the ones no one expects are often the ones he uses to shift everything. So take your sling, take your stone, and run toward the roar. For the valley is not where you lose, it's where the glory of God breaks in through the courage of those who believe.